I never imagined that one day, among the hundreds of job applications HR sent me to review, I would see the name that ripped my entire childhood open again. Evan Thornton. Those two words appeared on the first line of the email, standing out like a wound that had never healed. My hands froze on the keyboard. I read it again, then again, as if my eyes were trying to trick me. I thought I had escaped that past by moving thousands of miles from Seattle to California, building my own company, becoming the person I always wanted to be. But a small PDF file was enough to make my heart tighten like that 10-year-old kid cornered against the wall. I leaned back in my chair, breathed deeply, trying to calm myself while staring at the bright office on the 18th floor in Palo Alto. California sunlight poured through the massive glass windows, flooding the clean desks, glowing computer screens, and young engineers lost in lines of code. This was my world, where I was no longer the weak one, no longer the little brother who got beaten until he cried and then got scolded for crying too much. Here, I was Miles Thornton, CEO, founder of a data security company worth hundreds of millions. A place where I believed the past could no longer reach me. But the past always finds a way. I opened Evan's file. 35, divorced, unemployed, hopping from company to company over the past 3 years. No solid job. Signs of severe stress. I looked at those lines without knowing what to feel. Satisfaction? Jealousy? Or just a cold emptiness without a name? Because the truth was, no matter how badly Evan had hurt me, I never imagined I would see him fall to the bottom, the way the report described. Sophie, the HR manager, had accidentally moved his file into the interview shortlist because his experience fit the role. How ironic. If she knew Evan and I were brothers, she would probably fall out of her chair. I clicked on the experience section and memories crashed back in, drowning me. Evan's punches, the times he slammed me into the wall, my mother's yelling, family dinners where I was invisible, and me, the boy who would run into his room, close the door, and turn on the computer to feel like he still existed. Without those nights, I probably wouldn't have become a programmer, let alone a CEO. Half of my life was built on pain, and the other half on the will to survive. I glanced at the security camera feed of the interview room on another tab. This morning, it was empty. But soon, Evan would sit there, not knowing who he was about to face, not knowing that the person holding his future in their hands was the same little brother he once tormented. My phone vibrated. A message from my mother. "Are you free? I need you to help your brother Evan with something." I laughed, a bitter laugh. Perfect timing. She had always been like that with Evan. For more than 30 years, nothing had changed. Even when Evan became an adult and wrecked his own life, she still believed he just needs another chance. And me? I never received a chance from anyone. I locked my phone, stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked down at the bustling street below. A question echoed inside me, persistent like a voice in a cave. What am I going to do with him? Revenge? Or forgiveness? I used to think that when power was finally in my hands, I would know the answer instantly. But now that the moment had actually arrived, my heart felt tangled. A part of me wanted to see Evan lower his head before me, to taste the smallness I once lived with. But another part, the part I tried to bury, was asking the opposite. What makes me different from him? I returned to my desk, opened the email, and replied to Sophie. Move Evan to the in-person interview round. I want to evaluate this candidate myself. I hit send, and as soon as the cursor stopped blinking, a jolt ran through me. As if I had just opened a door leading to a confrontation I knew would change everything. I sat back in my chair, looked straight at the screen, and whispered, almost only loud enough for myself to hear. Then let's see who's in control now. I thought I had buried Seattle and everything from my past there a long time ago. But that night, when I returned to my apartment in San Francisco, the memories clung to me stubbornly like a shadow that refused to leave. I stood by the window, looking at the bright city lights, yet all I could see in my mind was the small old house where every storm of my childhood began. Those images appeared so clearly that I could almost hear Evan's footsteps pounding on the stairs, my mother's yelling regardless of who was right or wrong, and the tightness in my chest whenever I knew I was about to be punished with no one defending me. My childhood had no fairness, only fear and silence. I remembered the cramped kitchen with its old tile floor, the smell of my mother's morning coffee, the greasy scent of the fried eggs she always made for Evan, while I got whatever was left, if there was any. I remembered every bowl, every chair, and the way my mother looked at me whenever I tried to explain that I didn't break the plate, Evan did. She only said one short sentence: "You have to give in to your brother." In her world, Evan was always right, and I was always the mistake. No matter what I did, it was never enough. There was a time I was punished to stand outside in the backyard for 30 minutes under the rain because my mother believed I lied about Evan hitting me, when the truth was that he slammed my head against the wall just because I wanted the TV remote. I remembered shivering in the cold rain, shouting hoarsely, "I'm not lying! I'm not lying!" But my mother closed the door and didn't look back. I stood there, soaked, feeling like the whole world had abandoned me. I was only 8. The memories kept resurfacing in layers, like old film reels rewinding endlessly in my mind. I wondered, was it because of all that I became who I am now? Someone who built his life out of the determination to prove his worth, because no one ever saw him as a child. Someone who clung to work as an escape from the feeling of being unwanted. Someone who didn't believe in family, because the last time he trusted it, it shoved him down the stairs and left him there. I sank into the sofa, closed my eyes, and tried to breathe deeply. But then I remembered the math test when I was 10. The one I nearly aced. I brought it home proudly, hoping, just once, that my mother would praise me. But she only glanced and said, "Evan got even higher when he was your age." Evan stood behind me with his arms crossed, smirking. I swallowed my tears, just like I had done hundreds of times before. A child shouldn't have to learn how to swallow tears. But that was the first lesson I mastered. All of that pushed me to leave Seattle the moment I could. I applied to a university in San Francisco just so I could get as far away as possible. Not because I hated my family, but because I knew that if I stayed, I would never live properly. I would always be the overlooked younger son. And I promised myself, one day, I would stand in a place where no one could hurt me again. I opened my laptop and looked at Evan's file again. After all these years, he was still the beloved son. Despite unemployment, despite divorce, despite the mistakes that ruined his career, my mother still shielded him. I looked at those lines and wondered, had Evan ever thought about what he did to me? Or for him, were those things just small teenage nonsense? Close to midnight, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hesitated for a moment, but answered. "Miles," she began, as if there had never been any distance between us. "Evan is having a hard time. Do you know anyone at a big company? Can you help him find a stable job?" I laughed in the dark, a tired laughter cutting through my chest. She had no idea that the person Evan was applying to was me. And she didn't ask if I was okay, if I was happy, or if I needed help. She never had. I answered, "I'll see." Nothing more. No explanation. No mention of the interview. She didn't ask further. She only said, "I know you'll help your brother." Then hung up. I placed the phone on the table, suddenly feeling my spacious apartment becoming strangely empty. And in that moment I realized, no matter how many walls I built around my heart, one name, Evan Thornton, was enough to make everything collapse again. I stood, walked into my small office and turned on the desk lamp. On the table was an old photo of me and Evan when I was 5 and he was 8. My mother had forced me to smile, even though Evan had pinched me so hard my arm was red. I looked at the picture for a long time. Then I put it in a drawer. Tomorrow, he would walk into my company, and for the first time in 20 years, we would face each other, not as older brother and younger brother, but as the one in power and the one begging for a chance. I turned off the light, closed the door, and knew that the moment of confrontation was closer than ever. Monday morning arrived faster than I wanted. The entire night before, I tossed and turned, trying to distract myself with work but failing miserably. My mind kept circling back to one single point. Tomorrow, I would face Evan after 20 years. Not in the living room of our old house in Seattle, not under my mother's biased gaze, but in a completely different place. My company, my territory. The place where authority, decisions, and power belonged to me. And strangely, that didn't make me feel as strong as I had imagined. When I walked into the office at 8 a.m., the entire 18th floor was already buzzing with activity. Engineers discussing a new bug, the marketing team preparing a presentation, the receptionist greeting me with her usual smile. I nodded back, but my chest felt heavy. All of this, light, professionalism, success, should have made me proud. But today, everything made me feel like I was dragging my past into the future I worked so hard to build. John Pierce, my COO, stepped into my office with a cup of coffee. He looked at me for a moment, then asked bluntly, "Did you sleep?" I replied, "Not really." John set the cup on my desk, sat in the chair across from me, and folded his arms. He was one of the very few people I trusted, and the only one who knew about my childhood. "Evan will be here at 10, he said. "You're sure you want to interview him yourself?" I looked up at him. "I need to do this." John exhaled slowly, longer than usual. "I'm not against it. I just want you to remember you're not the cornered kid anymore. You're the CEO. You choose how this goes." I forced a small smile, part gratitude, part bitterness. That's the problem. I have the power, but I don't know how to use it. We went over a few project updates, though my mind kept drifting. Near 9 a.m., Sophie knocked on my door. She entered holding a folder. "Mr. Thornton, I'd like to inform you that candidate Evan Thornton has confirmed he'll arrive on time. I prepared the technical questions for the initial round." I nodded, trying to appear unfazed. "Good. Follow the usual procedure." Sophie walked out, but before the door closed, I saw her glance back at me. She must have sensed something odd. CEOs don't usually track mid-level candidates like this. At 9:50, I opened the camera feed for the interview room. My heart was beating too fast. I tried to calm myself, but my fingers still tightened unconsciously. Then, at exactly 9:57, the door opened. Evan walked in. I didn't recognize him immediately. He was thinner, shoulders drooping, hair messy, wearing a suit that didn't fit, as if he'd worn it too many times for failed interviews. But his eyes, the same eyes that once looked at me with arrogance, the same eyes that gleamed with challenge whenever he shoved me into a wall. They were still there, only now clouded with exhaustion and uncertainty. Sophie sat across from him, offering her professional smile. "Hi, Evan. Thank you for coming today. We'll start with some basic questions." Evan nodded, trying to appear confident. But I saw the small signs, his fingers twisting, his foot shaking lightly under the table. Signs of anxiety he probably never knew before. Evan wasn't terrible. Nobody wasn't impressive either. Some of the questions he dodged, especially those about the framework and conflict. When Sophie asked, "Have you ever had major conflict with major conflict?" Evan froze. He gave a strange smile. My younger strained and I, we always got along. Nobody now balancing me, as well as I laughed in my office, a short, sharp sound before I could stop myself. Got along well? If that was getting along, then World War II must have been a friendly dinner party. At 10:40, Sophie wrapped up the initial interview and said, "Now our CEO will join for the final round." Evan's face shifted. He clearly didn't expect to meet the CEO directly. As for me, I stood, straightened my shirt, looked into the mirror on the wall, and saw my face cold as ice. I stepped out, walking down the bright hallway. Each step felt heavier with memories. I opened the interview room door. Evan looked up. Time stopped. Evan froze. His eyes widened, his mouth slightly open but unable to speak. Sophie glanced between us, confused, and I, staring straight at the face that had haunted me for 2 decades, said, "Hello, Evan. Let's begin the final interview." I walked into the interview room, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. I felt it right away. A thick, cold tension that even Sophie seemed to notice as she slightly furrowed her brows. Evan was still sitting there, his eyes still wide as if he hadn't yet caught up with the reality that the person he was about to face wasn't some distant CEO, but the very younger brother he once crushed without hesitation. I looked directly into his eyes, not avoiding, not hiding, as if I wanted him to understand that this time, we stood in completely different positions. "Thank you, Sophie," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'll take it from here." Sophie stood up, glanced briefly at Evan, then turned to me as though she wanted to ask something, but in the end, only nodded before leaving the room. The door closed, and Evan and I were left in a silence so deep I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Evan still couldn't speak. He blinked a few times, his throat moving as if swallowing something stuck inside. I sat down across from him, back straight, placing my tablet on the table the same way I did with every other candidate. But both of us knew this wasn't an ordinary interview. "How are you, Evan?" I asked. A polite question, but carrying layers of emotions only I could understand. He opened his mouth, but only a small sound came out. "Miles, you're the CEO here?" "That's right," I replied without any hesitation. "This company is mine." A long, heavy silence followed. I stared at him, seeing the panic, the confusion, the shame he tried to hide. I didn't know what I expected. An immediate apology? A breakdown? A familiar burst of anger? But Evan only lowered his head, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. "I reviewed your file," I began. "You worked at 3 companies in the last 3 years. None longer than 8 months. Evan didn't look up, only nodded slightly. "Why did you leave?" He swallowed. "Didn't fit. Some personal problems." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of personal problems?" He stayed silent for a long moment, then spoke in a voice small but more honest. "Divorce, depression, and other complications." I leaned forward slightly, studying him. This wasn't the Evan I remembered, the one always puffing up his chest, the one trying to prove he was stronger, the one shielded by our mother. The man in front of me was a version that had hit rock bottom and was clawing upward without knowing what to hold on to. "I have another question," I said. "In your interview with Sophie, you said you and your younger brother always got along." Evan stiffened, then looked up at me, eyes wide with panic. "Miles, I didn't know who Sophie was. I didn't think you'd be the CEO of—" "I'm not asking about Sophie," I cut him off. "I'm asking about your answer." Evan fell silent. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. He opened his mouth, closed it again, as if the words were stuck inside his chest. Finally, he said softly, "I didn't know how to answer that truthfully." I studied him for a long moment. Part of me wanted to unleash everything I had held inside all these years. But another part, the calmer, unexpected part, sat still, as if I had finally reached a place where Evan could no longer hurt me. "I'll ask again," I said slowly. "If you had the chance to talk to your younger brother again, what would you say?" Evan's breath trembled. His eyes turned visibly red. He looked down, avoiding my gaze, as though unworthy of meeting it. "I would say," his voice cracked, "that I'm sorry. For everything. For what I did. For how I treated him. For being a terrible brother." I didn't expect my chest to tighten at those words. Part of me wanted to ask, "So why did it take your life falling apart to say it?" But I didn't speak. I only sat there, listening to every word. Evan continued, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but if he's doing well, if he's successful, then I'm glad. At least, I didn't drag him down with me." I inhaled deeply. My emotions were a chaotic mix, hard to describe. I waited so long for an apology. But when it finally came, it didn't bring the satisfaction I imagined. Only a quiet sadness. I closed my tablet. "This interview is over." Evan looked up, worried. "Miles, can you—" "I'll review your application," I said, my tone so neutral, even I couldn't hear the tremor beneath it. "You may step outside." Evan stood, slightly unsteady. Before he reached the door, I called out, "Evan!" He turned back, waiting. I looked straight into his eyes and said, "This time, every decision about your future is in my hands." Evan didn't answer. He only lowered his head, as if recognizing the weight of that truth. Then he left the room, leaving me alone. I leaned back, covering my eyes with my hand, feeling everything I'd suppressed for years rising up. Not anger, but something else. Something I wasn't ready to name. I remained in the interview room for quite a while after Evan left. For some reason, I couldn't stand up immediately. It felt like I had just reopened a door that had been sealed for 20 years, and everything trapped behind it. Dampness, old fear, yelling, punches, all came rushing out to wrap around me. I thought that facing Evan directly would make me feel stronger, even victorious. But what I felt now was an emptiness I couldn't explain. I didn't know if it was exhaustion, resurfacing pain, or something else. Something I wasn't ready to name. When I finally stood up, I regained my usual composure and walked toward my office. But right at the door, John was waiting. He crossed his arms, staring at me for a long moment. "You all right?" I answered, "I'm fine." John lifted an eyebrow. "Whenever you say I'm fine, I know you're absolutely not fine." I exhaled, leaning back against the desk. "He apologized." John's expression shifted with surprise. "Really?" "Yes." I stared at the floor as if an answer was hidden beneath the tiles. "But I don't know what to do next." John didn't speak for a moment. Then he stepped inside, motioning for me to close the door. I did. He sat across from me, staring directly at me. "Miles, you don't have to rush a decision. What matters most is that you separate two things: the CEO's decision and the little brother's decision." I let out a faint, bitter laugh. "Those things were never separate." John shook his head. "No, you have to separate them. Otherwise you'll drag your past into the future you built." I went quiet, his words looping through my mind. As a CEO, I knew hiring needed to be based on skill, fit, and value. As a younger brother who had been abused, I carried resentment that would take years to dissolve. I had every right to reject Evan. I had every right to retaliate. But would that make me any different from the Evan he once was? The afternoon dragged on with routine meetings, but my thoughts kept returning to the image of Evan sitting with his head lowered. A once proud man reduced to something fragile. I didn't know if that was the truth, or just the way life punished those who made too many wrong turns. As the sun began to set, Sophie knocked on my door. "Mr. Thornton, candidate Evan Thornton is still in the lobby. I told him the interview was over and he could go home, but..." "He doesn't want to leave?" "Yes. He said he wants to know the result, or at least talk to you again." I glanced out the window, the fading light casting a soft orange glow across Palo Alto. A part of me wanted to let him wait all day, the way I used to be left waiting for meals, for apologies, for acknowledgement I never got. But another part of me lifted me to my feet. "I'll see him," I said. I walked through the hallway again, and this time every step felt lighter. In the lobby, Evan sat in the corner, hands interlocked, head bowed. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. "Thank you for talking to me," he said, voice still trembling. I folded my arms, keeping a distance. "Why are you still here?" Evan swallowed. "I wanted to say one more thing." I waited. Evan stood up, his back slightly bent, as if he were afraid of me. Something I never imagined I would see. He looked at the floor and said, "I know how terribly I treated you. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I'm at the worst point of my life, Miles. I have nothing left. My job, my family, my friends, everything is gone. And his voice cracked. "I don't know who else to hold on to." I felt my throat tighten. I forced my voice to remain cool. "And you think I'll be the one to save you?" Evan stayed silent for a long time, then shook his head. "No, I don't dare think that. I just wanted to say sorry again. Not in the interview room, but here, as your brother." That sentence made me freeze. I didn't know how to respond. I had imagined countless scenarios. Evan denying everything, Evan getting angry, Evan playing the victim like he used to. But I had not prepared for this version, an Evan worn out, exhausted, and honest. I inhaled deeply and said, I haven't decided yet. Evan nodded, eyes still red. I know, and I'll respect whatever you decide. Another silence followed. Then Evan added softly, "Thank you for listening." I turned away before he could see the flicker of hesitation on my face. After a few steps, Evan called out, "Miles!" I stopped. "If you give me a chance," he said, "I won't let you down again." I looked at him one last time, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the brother who bullied me, the one who held power over me. I saw a man who had lost everything and was clinging to a fragile branch of hope. I didn't respond. I just walked away. But I knew deep down that the moment I walked away was also the moment I would have to make a decision that could change both our lives. I returned to my office after the lobby conversation and tried to focus on the documents I needed to review. But I couldn't. Every time I picked up a pen, Evan's image resurfaced. The bowed head, the trembling voice, the exhausted face of a man who had lost his direction. I hated this feeling. I hated my heart wavering. Part of me wanted to shut the door completely, to protect myself from old wounds. But another part of me was tangled, as if I were standing at a crossroads where both paths led to things I wasn't ready to face. That afternoon, John walked into my office with a report in hand, though his eyes weren't on the report. He set it down and said directly, "So what are you going to do?" I sighed. "I don't know." "You can't let this hang forever," John continued. "HR needs a decision, and Evan is clearly waiting." Of course I knew. I knew everyone needed an answer from me, not just as the CEO, but as someone who had been hurt. But this decision wasn't simple. It wouldn't just affect the company. It could reopen a door I'd kept shut for 20 years. John sat across from me, more serious than usual. "Miles, I'm not speaking as COO, but as your friend. You need to ask yourself, do you really want him out of your life forever? Or are you afraid that if you give him a chance, you'll be hurt again?" Every word hit deeper than I expected. I answered, "I don't want to get pulled back into the old cycle. I don't want to become that weak child again." John leaned back. "Are you still that child now?" A simple question, but it made something catch inside me. I didn't answer immediately. I knew the truth. I wasn't that child anymore. But a part of my memory still didn't accept that truth. Around 6 p.m., as the city lights began glowing outside, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something pushed me to answer. "Miles?" A woman's voice, slightly shaky. "This is Linda, Evan's ex-wife." I straightened, gripping the phone. "Why are you calling me?" "I know Evan interviewed at your company today," she said hesitantly. "I wanted to tell you something you might not know." I sat down, sensing that what came next wouldn't be easy. "Evan wasn't always good," Linda said. "He was arrogant, quick-tempered, and sometimes selfish. But in the last 2 years, he changed a lot. The divorce wasn't just because of his temper. He truly fell apart. Lost his job, lost direction, lost confidence. Actually, Evan went to therapy for a while." I tilted my head slightly, surprised. "Therapy?" "Yes," Linda said. "He had too many unresolved issues. He said most of it started with the relationship between him and his younger brother. He never forgave himself for what he did. And he believes he doesn't deserve to be loved." Something stirred inside me, neither pity nor satisfaction. More like realizing there was a part of Evan I never knew. Linda continued, "I'm not saying you should help him. I just think you should know he's trying to change, even if it's late." We ended the call in a long silence. When I put down the phone, I sat there motionless. What Linda said didn't make me forgive Evan, but it opened a perspective I had never considered. That Evan, too, was a victim of poor parenting, favoritism, and the pressure to be the perfect son. I looked out the window, the reflection of city lights scattering across the glass. I thought of today's Evan, not the bully, but a man exhausted and trying to rise. I knew I couldn't make a decision based on fleeting emotions. I needed clarity. I stood and went downstairs. Evan was still sitting there, even though more than 2 hours had passed. When he saw me, he stood immediately. "I thought you went home," he said quietly. "I was thinking," I replied. I motioned for him to follow me into a small meeting room near the lobby. The space was calm, softly lit. Evan sat stiffly, and I stood near the door for a moment before speaking. Evan, I said, do you truly want to change? Without a millisecond of hesitation, Evan nodded. Yes. Are you looking for a job because you want to save your life? Or because you want to become a better person? Evan looked at me, sincerity clear in a way I had never seen in him before. Both, he said. But more importantly, I want a chance to make things right with you. Even if you never forgive me, I want to try. I didn't speak for several seconds. His honesty stunned me. Finally, I exhaled and sat down across from him. I haven't made a decision, I said, but I will give you a chance to prove that what you just said is real. A chance, nothing more. Not forgiveness. Evan lowered his head. I understand. And for the first time that evening, I felt a small space open within me. Not for forgiveness, not for forgetting, but to see things more clearly. And that was when I knew that tomorrow, I would have to give him my final answer. The next morning, I arrived at the company earlier than usual. The Palo Alto sky was still covered in a light mist, with the first rays of sunlight barely cutting between the low buildings, casting a light that felt both cold and quiet. The office was empty, with only the hum of machines and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. I liked this time of day. Before everyone arrived, before the work piled up, before I had to face all the difficult decisions that had been spinning in my mind. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and looked at the candidate evaluation list. Evan Thornton's name was in the third row. Beside it were skill scores, experience notes, and comments from the first interview round. Objectively speaking, he qualified for the position. He wasn't outstanding, but he wasn't bad either. If he weren't my brother, I could have evaluated him like any other candidate, based on ability, not memory. A knock sounded at the door. John walked in with a cup of coffee and gave me a knowing look. You thought all night, didn't you? I only said, yes. It's time to choose, Miles. I knew. But the choice wasn't just about the job. It touched a part of the past I'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Every time I thought about bringing Evan into the company, images returned. Me curled in a corner, Evan kicking the door open, my collar being grabbed, the yelling, the forced silence. Those memories didn't disappear easily. John placed the coffee on my desk. I'm not telling you to forgive him. I'm saying, sometimes giving someone a chance isn't about whether they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. I stared at him. If I hire him, things will get complicated. Not hiring him will also be complicated, John replied calmly. The question is what kind of complicated you can live with. I let out a short laugh. Not happy, not miserable, just honest. Maybe he was right. Avoiding the decision wouldn't make anything easier. It would only delay the truth. Around 9 a.m., Sophie texted me that Evan had arrived. He was waiting in the lobby. My chest tightened slightly. I stood up, straightened my shirt, took a deep breath, and walked out. When I entered the main lobby, Evan immediately stood up. He was dressed more neatly today, seemed more composed, but the worry in his eyes was unmistakable. Miles, he said, almost standing at attention. Thank you for seeing me yesterday. I nodded. Today, I have your answer. His shoulders stiffened, not in fear, but in a tense anticipation. I reviewed everything, I said slowly. And I've decided to give you a 3-month probation period. Evan's eyes widened. He clearly hadn't expected that. For a moment, surprise flickered, followed by something like relief, gratitude, and a hint of shame. You're really giving me a chance? I told you, I said. It's only a chance, not forgiveness. Evan bowed his head deeply. The first time in my life I'd seen him do that. I understand, he said, voice thick. I won't disappoint you again. I studied him, not to judge his sincerity, but to confront the feeling rising inside me. Something not exactly light, not exactly painful. More like a door opening just enough for light to slip through. Good, I said. You'll work directly with John's team. No privileges, no exceptions. You're like any other employee. Yes, Evan replied quickly. I don't want any privileges. I turned to leave, but Evan called out, Miles? I paused. Thank you, he said. Not just for the job, but for giving me a chance to make things right. I didn't know how to respond. I only nodded and walked away. But as the elevator doors closed, I realized my hands were trembling. Not from fear, but because I knew that from today onward, everything would change, in ways I couldn't predict. Throughout the morning, I watched Evan from afar through internal cameras. He worked quietly, focused, without trying to draw attention. Part of me felt eased. Another part stayed wary. I knew people could change, but old wounds didn't vanish overnight. At lunchtime, John came into my office. "How's it going, okay?" "Okay, for now," I said. John chuckled. "That's life." I looked out the window, the bright midday sun blanketing the city in gold. Downstairs, Evan stood alone at the water dispenser, filling a small cup. Seeing him like that pulled me back 20 years. 2 kids in the same house, but living in entirely different worlds. I wondered if we could learn to stand beside each other without causing more damage. I didn't know, but at least I chose the path with less darkness. And now, all that remained was to see what he would do with the chance he'd been given. The 3-month probation passed faster than I expected. Evan arrived on time every day, often earlier than most employees. He sat in a quiet corner, worked diligently, took detailed notes, and asked John or team members whenever he didn't understand part of a project. He never relied on me, never used our family relationship to gain favor. I observed all of this, from afar, through cameras, through John's updates, through the team's attitude. And one thing was undeniable. Evan was truly trying. Yet what I struggled with wasn't the present. It was the old memories refusing to sleep. No matter how much he changed, sometimes a loud sound, a door pushed too hard, or someone raising their voice made my heart tighten like the child I used to be. I reminded myself, I was different. I wasn't small anymore. I wasn't in danger. But the heart doesn't always follow logic. One late afternoon, after a long meeting, I sat alone in the large conference room. The glass walls reflected the bright orange sunset, and the city outside was shifting into evening lights. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to relax. When I opened them, I saw Evan standing at the door. "Sorry," he said softly, not daring to step in. The door was slightly open. I knocked, but I guess you didn't hear. "It's fine," I replied, pointing to the seat across from me. "What is it?" Evan walked in, closed the door, and sat down awkwardly. I could see the nervousness on him. He was always tense around me, afraid to make even the smallest mistake. "Tomorrow is the end of my probation," Evan said, voice trembling. "I know you've been watching everything, and I know you've never made things easy for me. I don't blame you. I just want to thank you for giving me these 3 months." I stayed silent, waiting. These 3 months have been the calmest in my life in years. Maybe you don't believe it, but being able to work normally, be treated like a regular person, not have people look at me with contempt, that means a lot to me. He paused, hands tightening. But more importantly, I've learned to accept that I used to be terrible. I want to change, even if I can never undo the past. I leaned back. "What do you think I should do now?" Evan swallowed. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you can look at who I am now, not who I used to be. If you decide to end things here, I'll understand." I rested my elbows on the table. "Do you believe in yourself? Believe you'll change for real, long term?" Evan took a deep breath. "Yes. For the first time in my life, I believe that." It wasn't an excuse. It sounded like a truth he had fought hard to reach. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at the glowing city. Behind me, Evan stayed still, probably thinking my silence meant rejection. But the truth was, I was thinking about something else. I had spent my life running from the past, and maybe that was exactly why it kept dragging me back. Now, facing it didn't feel as heavy as before. I turned around. "You're officially hired," I said. Evan froze. He couldn't speak for a few seconds. He just stared at me, stunned. "You... really? I'm not doing this for you," I said evenly. "I'm doing it for myself. I don't want the past controlling me anymore. I'll give you a chance, but a chance comes with responsibility." I understand, he said, eyes turning red. "I'll work even harder." I nodded, adding, "But this doesn't mean everything between us is resolved. You need to understand that. Evan lowered his head. I know. I don't expect you to forget. I only hope you won't hurt because of me anymore. That made me pause. I looked at him, and for the first time in decades, I realized that in Evan's eyes, there was no arrogance, no dominance, no shadow of the past. Only a man trying to do what's right. No Hollywood ending, no magical forgiveness, no dramatic hugs, no tears of reconciliation. Just two people, one trying to make amends, one learning to set his pain down. Evan stood, bowed deeply. Thank you, Miles. I answered. You start officially tomorrow. From now on, your actions will speak for you. Evan left the room with light but trembling steps, as if he had entered a new door he wasn't sure he deserved. When the door closed, I sat down and exhaled deeply. I didn't know what the future would bring. I didn't know if Evan would truly change. But I knew one thing for certain. I no longer felt trapped by the past. Perhaps this wasn't an ending, but a beginning, fragile but real.